morning, everybody. My name is Henry Grub, and I'm presenting today about a comparison of different approaches to badger vaccination against bovine tuberculosis as a disease control mechanism. So to start off with, a quick tuberculosis 101. Bovine tuberculosis is a bacterial disease caused by Mycobacterium bovis, and it infects a wide range of mammalian hosts, predominantly cattle and badgers here in the UK. Transmission of the disease can occur between cattle and badgers in both directions, both directly and indirectly. And cattle incidence is predominantly in the west and southwest of England and the south of Wales as well. This incidence map that we have here on the screen also maps very closely to the density of cattle in the country as well. We're going to focus today just mainly on England and English policy as the situation in Wales is devolved. Okay, so to give you an idea of the scale that we're talking about here, last year over 20,000 cattle were mandatorily slaughtered in England because they tested positive for bovine tuberculosis. Over the same period of time, a similar number, 19,500 badgers, were culled under licence in England as well to sort of prevent the spread of disease from badgers to cattle. So this by far makes it the biggest disease in terms of death of livestock in the UK currently. And with that number of badgers killed, it also makes it a significant challenge for wildlife conservation and countryside ecology as well. So it's a very important issue. So vaccination as an alternative to culling. The BCG vaccine has been around for some time now for human form tuberculosis. It's been used in humans. That has then been evolved into what's referred to as the badger BCG, which is a variant of the vaccine designed to combat bovine tuberculosis in badgers. Now, depending on where the government currently sits with regard to policy, it's changing a little bit, but generally speaking, we expect this to be the case after the general election as well. Any future administration is probably going to shift to scale up badger vaccination in some way, shape, or form. We already have some experimental evidence that vaccination lowers badger population TB levels, so a vaccine is effective. That's good, obviously, from a disease control perspective. But what do farmers think about vaccination? This is where we end up with our research problem, or a problem in general. You need landholders' consent to undertake badger vaccination schemes, just like with badger culling schemes as well. And therefore, how landholders, in particularly farmers in this case, how they perceive vaccination, and indeed how these schemes get set up, is going to affect the satisfaction of those schemes. So that leads us to our research question. There's two research questions I'm going to answer in today's talk. The first one, what can we learn from existing vaccination schemes about what affects perceived success and satisfaction for the landholders? And then can we use that to form any recommendations about how schemes should be designed for scale up in the future? So how am I going to answer those questions? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be comparing case studies. We have 3 case studies, projects in Cornwall, in Derbyshire, and in East Sussex in England. The Cornish scheme in the southwest there is right in the heart of the high-risk zone, really high cattle incidence of tuberculosis. Our Derbyshire scheme in the sort of North Midlands, that's in the edge area between high-risk zones and low-risk zones. So they're sort of in this intermediate area. And in East Sussex, there should be a low-risk zone. It's surrounded by low-risk zone, not much TB around it, but East Sussex itself is a hotspot. It's where there's an abnormally high amount of TB in the cattle in that particular area. Let's go into a bit more context for these case studies in just a second. In each of these areas, I conducted semi-structured interviews with participants who were people who had signed up and opted into badger vaccination in those areas. And they were also given a Likert scale questionnaire where they were asked to score their thoughts before and after to simulate a longitudinal study. I'll go into more detail about that. So first of all, in Cornwall, they've been vaccinating since 2019. It's a very small project initiated by farmers, unusually. It's administered by the Cornwall Wildlife Trust, but it's been carried out by staff at the Zoological Society of London, who've used this as a scientific experiment to blood test for bovine tuberculosis in the badgers over the course of the vaccination project to try and gain scientific data to figure out whether it works. In contrast, in East Sussex, they've been vaccinating for less time, since 2021. It's a much larger project. It's run by a local veterinary group, carried out by contractors. The vets have recruited the participants, a very large pool of participants. Many of them are existing clients to the vet group. And in Derbyshire, Well, they've been vaccinating since 2015. It's run by the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. It's carried out by volunteers differently. And the Wildlife Trust is recruiting participants. There's a lot of emphasis on badger welfare and conservation. So let's have some more context. What motivated farmers to join their schemes? We might expect that the reasons why farmers would join a scheme would be uniform across the board, but that isn't what we found in our key informant interviews, in those semi-structured interviews. There are clear differences in why farmers are choosing to join. This is a heat map that shows the most popular reasons that farmers mentioned in their interviews as to why they joined the schemes. And there's clear differences between these three case studies. In Cornwall, the most popular reason was that they preferred vaccination over culling, specifically that phrasing. At the time, 2019, when they were recruiting for a vaccination scheme, they were also recruiting for a badger cull scheme at the same time, a different group of people. So they had a direct choice. Which do I want, vaccination or culling? And so that's why there's this preference mentioned, because they were literally choosing between the two. And of course, those who joined the vaccination scheme preferred the vaccination scheme because they obviously joined it. In Derbyshire, there's also that anti-cull sentiment, but it's phrased differently because there was no competing cull in 2015. Instead, the phrasing is around wanting to look after and protect the healthy badgers that are on their land and wanting to stop a future cull from ever happening by already having the land in a vaccination scheme. In Sussex, there was a greater variety of reasons cited, but the most popular one was just this need to do something about TB infection levels. In fact, that's the only reason that was really present across all three case study sites. And note it's more popular as a reason in Cornwall and Sussex, where TB cases are higher, than it is in Derbyshire, where TB cases are lower. So differences in scheme setup and recruitment of those participants, who's doing the recruiting, has been reflected in participant motivations. It's not clear which caused the other, and there's probably some sort of, it's not probably a direct causal relationship, but it doesn't really matter which way around it is. It matters that there is a reflection. They are linked. So let's have a look at the Likert scale questionnaires now. The questionnaires that they received had two types of questions, these standalone questions and then these paired questions. Standalone questions were like this. How successful do you think badger vaccination has been at managing TB in cattle? They were marking on a 1 to 6 scale. 1 usually was more negative, 6 was more positive. And then there were these paired questions, which were on one of two halves of this questionnaire form. One was this sort of past tense, and one was this present tense phrasing. Before you joined the vaccination scheme, how enthusiastic were you about the idea of badger vaccination? And then the next question is, how enthusiastic are you now about the idea of badger vaccination? And so we can compare the average answer given across the pool of respondents with each of these paired questions to see if there was a shift over the time. I'm only going to present the Cornish and Sussex data. I'm heading up to Derbyshire on Sunday to collect more of the data for this research. The sample size isn't quite large enough to do this quantitative analysis, sorry. So the standalone questions first. This bar chart plots the median response given on those scales. The error bars show the interquartile range of responses. The lower down on the bar is the less successful, and the more successful is the higher up in the bar. The actual numbers don't matter so much as the difference between Cornwall and Sussex. Is there a difference? We wouldn't necessarily expect to see a difference, but there indeed is a difference, a very clear difference. Look here, success at reducing TB in badgers. Cornish farmers think the scheme has been way more successful than Sussex farmers. Why? Because in Cornwall, as I mentioned earlier, the ZSL team have been collecting blood data on whether TB levels are going up and down. And that blood data has shown that there has been significant decreases in the prevalence of TB in badgers over the course of the project. Now, the farmers know this because they're told that information. And so, unsurprisingly, they're very happy with that information. That's what they want to hear. That means the vaccination scheme is working. So they think it's therefore been very successful. Sussex farmers do not have this information. They don't do any blood testing. All they know is how many badgers were vaccinated in a year. They have no data about how successful it's been, and so they've just plumped for the middle of the road sort of answer. When we look at the success in reducing TB in cattle, we don't actually see very many score differences between how successful they think it's been in badgers. They tend to carry over the same score for cattle. Note that actually in both schemes, they rated as very well managed. And this was also the case in Derbyshire. Regardless of the scheme, participants seem very happy with how it's been managed, how it's been implemented, which is good news. And then as a bit of contextual information, there was a much higher pre-vaccination enthusiasm for culling in Sussex than there was in Cornwall, where they seemed more anti-culling. So there's evidence emerging from this that providing Quantitative evidence to farmers improves perceived success, obviously when that evidence is showing that the scheme is working, of course. So what about the paired questions? Well, the first one I want to present is the knowledge of TB levels in badgers. Had it changed from before and after? And this result isn't necessarily surprising. This shows the box plot distribution of answers given. Green is Cornwall, the purple is Sussex, and then the light colours are before and the dark colours are after. And we can see from our Wilcox and signed rank tests that there's a significant difference in Cornwall, not significant in Sussex as we might expect. Cornish farmers know more now about TB levels in their badgers than they did before. Now that's not surprising. As we say, we've been blood sampling the badgers in Cornwall. We've been giving them that direct information. That information has been showing TB is going down in the badgers. They're obviously very happy about that. So that's not necessarily very surprising to us. But the important paired question we wanted to understand, had enthusiasm for vaccination changed? Were they actually more interested, more enthusiastic about vaccination? This is where we saw a really strong effect. Cornish farmers actually were less enthusiastic about vaccination beforehand than the Sussex farmers, as well as also being less enthusiastic about culling. They're just not very enthusiastic people, clearly. But after the scheme, they're reporting much higher enthusiasm with vaccination, a very significant effect with no change in Sussex. Why is that? Well, we know they've been seeing data that shows that it's working. That's obviously going to increase enthusiasm. But I wonder about another theory here, that actually there could be an additive effect with this sort of idea of co-production. Because in Cornwall, as I mentioned, it was the farmers who initiated the project. They actually helped set it up. They helped plan it all. They've helped implement it. It's a smaller group, so it's more easy to do that. In the Sussex scheme, it's a much more top-down management, very large scheme. The vet clinic comes in, they run it, you just sign your land up, we'll deal with the rest. Thanks. So there's this element of actually maybe co-production. The farmers feel like they've actually contributed to producing this evidence, and that's generated buy-in and generated enthusiasm as a result. So what can we conclude from all of this information? Well, our first conclusion would be our case study comparison has shown there are significant differences between these schemes, despite the fact the protocol for actually undertaking vaccination is set nationally. What they're doing in the fields, other than the blood testing, is exactly the same. So we'd expect it to have the same outcomes scientifically. But there are significant differences in how the participants feel about that. So there are four key things we want to take away from this. The first is that farmers value evidence that schemes are working. This is improving perceived success and enthusiasm. Now, this seems really obvious to us because we're a room of scientists, but goes right against the perceived wisdom about how farmers think. Farmers think with gut instinct. They think, I know that this is what works, and the scientific evidence, has marginal impacts on how I think. But that's not what we've shown. Farmers' gut instinct may be something beforehand, but if you give them genuine evidence that something is working, then they change their minds about it. They're more enthusiastic about it. That's a really important point to note. Farmers across all the different schemes, though, have felt that they've been well managed and want to continue in them. That's obviously positive. Then there's that evidence of co-production in Cornwall, maybe an additive effect as well as the scheme is also working. Farmers have been part in setting up the scheme. They're co-producing scientific knowledge. That might be leading to that higher enthusiasm. So my recommendation might be that if you design schemes with a co-production of knowledge element initially, then that could be a vaccination rollout strategy to improve buy-in in the first place. Now, this is all really exciting work. I'm really pleased to have been part of it and undertaken it. It's got real-world implications for government policy. The government's consultation on bovine tuberculosis closed just a couple of weeks ago, and CEP submitted a response that was written by me and enabled by the senior management team at CEP. So we're already starting to use these inferences to inform government policy, and of course it will be up to the next administration to process the results of that survey and set a new national policy. So thank you very much.